So I posted a carbon sequestration video not too long ago in which I discussed how microbes basically control how soil works. They make plants possible, they make us possible, they make everything possible. They basically run the world. And so in this video, I'd like to discuss how microbes run the world. The reason I'm making this video is because I got some comments on that, and I think other videos where I talk about microbes' impact on life on Earth. And I got a comment from someone saying basically that they understand that microbes fix nitrogen. In other words, they convert atmospheric nitrogen gas into nitrogen usable for other life, but they weren't sure in what other ways microbes contributed to making other nutrients available to plants and other higher life forms. And I talked about in that video or in that comment chain, I can't remember, about how microbes also make phosphorus, sulfur, and other bioessential elements or nutrients available for higher life. So this is the video in which I'm going to explain how they do that, because I couldn't do it in a comment chain. I would have just been typing for days. So first things first, I'll talk about the importance of microbes, and this has a lot to do with them driving what's called biogeochemical cycles. So I'll talk about what biogeochemical cycles are, and then I'll talk a little bit about the diversity of microbial metabolic pathways out there. In other words, the diversity of kind of reactions that microbes use to gain energy. Our metabolism is we breathe in oxygen and we eat organic carbon, which we convert using that oxygen into carbon dioxide. And through this process, we transport a bunch of electrons across this chain of molecules that kind of take the electrons and continue passing it down the chain. It's called an electron transport chain. Anyway, I won't get into that, but basically from that we gain energy, or ATP, which is kind of life's energy. And microbes do this too, but they don't always use oxygen and organic carbon. They actually use a lot of different chemicals and compounds, and I'm going to be giving some examples in this video which have a lot to do with how they make nutrients more available for higher life forms like ourselves. And with that, I will discuss how they affect and drive the carbon cycle, nitrogen cycle, sulfur cycle, phosphorus cycle, and iron and manganese cycles, as all of these cycles are essential for all life on Earth. And finally, I'll finish out the video by talking a little bit about how they degrade organic matter and how that actually helps to continue to provide nutrients to life, and the types of secondary metabolites they produce. In other words, kind of secondary products from their metabolism that they produce that we can also use for a lot of different applications actually, and why they're so important for that as well. So first things first, microbes are incredibly important for forming bioessential compounds. Again, this is kind of similar to what I mentioned earlier with fixing nitrogen from the atmosphere into something that life can use. Because most life, like plants and ourselves, we can't just breathe in atmospheric nitrogen and make it into some useful organic nitrogen compound in our bodies. We actually have to rely on eating like plants and organic matter to get our nitrogen, which they get it from these microbes that convert the atmospheric nitrogen into something they can take up. So microbes are essential in that and many other ways that we'll discuss in this video, for making, bioessential compounds that are usable, available to life. Microbes, including bacteria, archaea, fungi, and protists, are also basically present in every habitat on Earth. Every habitat where there's life, microbes will be found, and they drive the biogeochemical cycles. Again, we need to define what biogeochemical cycles are in order to understand why this is so important. So basically, biogeochemical cycles are the transfer of essential elements between Earth's biosphere, in other words, its life, its atmosphere, the air, water bodies, the hydrosphere, including the ocean, lakes, ice, glaciers, etc., and Earth's crust, Earth's geosphere. So all of these different spheres are kind of like different reservoirs in which chemicals can be held and stored for a while, and then they can transfer between these reservoirs, like, for example, water going from the atmosphere in this cloud, raining down and going into this plant, and then going into the hydrosphere, etc. But the water cycle is only one example of a biogeochemical cycle, and it kind of is like the fundamental one that carries all the other elements through their cycles. And we tend to focus on the CHNOPS elements when we talk about biogeochemical cycles. CHNOPS stands for carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur, which are the essential elements for life. There are other, essential elements like iron, manganese, which we'll talk about later, and other trace metals that are also essential but in less, abundance than the CHNOPS elements. So we'll talk about all of these cycles, but these are the typical. We tend to talk about biogeochemical cycles that involve elements that are essential for life, because then that adds on the bio component. And these cycles maintain global nutrient balance and sustain life on Earth. Without the biogeochemical cycles, we would not have life on Earth. And microbes play a huge role in sometimes catalyzing these transfers between different chemical reservoirs, or storing certain elements in certain reservoirs. For example, some microbes live in soils, and they kind of hold on to and store molybdenum ions within the soil and keep them there for a long enough time that they can use them when they need them. The reason molybdenum is really important to certain microbes, especially nitrogen fixing bacteria, is because in order to carry out the metabolism, nitrogen fixation, these microbes need to have the enzyme responsible for this pathway. And the enzyme itself uses molybdenum and iron in the enzyme's active center, which is kind of where the reaction takes place, really. And that's just because molybdenum and iron are elements that are really good at transferring electrons and kind of exchanging electrons. And so they're really good for enzymes like this. So molybdenum is essential for that enzyme called nitrogenase, which fixes nitrogen from the atmosphere. And thus they have some mechanisms where they can store it in the soil or prevent it from leaching out of the soil too fast so they can use it. And they have mechanisms like this for all sorts of bioessential element cycles. But as we'll see throughout this video, a reoccurring theme in the way that microbes affect global biogeochemical cycles is by their metabolism. So I want to take a second just really quick to define metabolism. Basically, these are just life-sustaining reactions carried out by an organism. Again, I explained our metabolism earlier, and this metabolism that all life does has basically three main functions. One, convert food to energy, or ATP, so that we can use that energy for cellular processes and maintaining our cells, really. Two, converting food into proteins, lipids, nucleic acids, and carbohydrates, the four main things that life and cells kind of use to carry out these cellular processes. Again, like I mentioned earlier, many types of metabolic pathways rely on enzymes that catalyze those processes, and enzymes are proteins, and so we need to do the metabolism to gain the energy to make the proteins to keep doing the metabolism, etc. And the last thing is the elimination of waste. So these are the three main functions of metabolism. And microbes employ a variety of different metabolic reactions or pathways. One example is fermentation, which is the anaerobic or non-oxygen involving organic carbon oxidation. And then respiration, which is again organic carbon oxidation by an inorganic electron acceptor. But instead, this can be aerobic, which involves oxygen, but you can also have anaerobic respiration, which involves a non-oxygen compound as the electron acceptor, such as sulfate. And I'll give an example of the use of sulfate for this later. Photosynthesis is another type of metabolic pathway, which is the conversion of light to chemical energy. There are, obviously plants which do this, that take up carbon dioxide and water, and they split the water molecule and they make oxygen. Well, there's other organisms that do photosynthesis using light to convert it to chemical energy, but they use other compounds other than water. For example, there's one that uses hydrogen sulfide, H2S, instead of H2O, and their product is sulfur instead of oxygen, which is pretty cool, and I'll talk about them later as well. Another example of microbial metabolism is chemosynthesis, which is the conversion of inorganic carbon, like carbon dioxide or methane, into organic carbon by oxidizing compounds or ions like molecular hydrogen, hydrogen sulfide, or reduced iron or reduced manganese. A couple things here just so we're not, getting too far into the jargon and so you keep up with the video. Oxidizing, this word I've used a couple times here, it just refers to the taking of electrons from that thing. In other words, organic carbon, for example, is reduced. It has an abundance of electrons that it wants to give away to something that's willing to accept them, like an electron acceptor. And when the electron acceptor takes those electrons from the organic carbon, it oxidizes the organic carbon. It takes the electrons away from it, and it reduces the electron acceptor. It gives electrons to the acceptor, reducing it. So that's kind of what oxidizing and reducing means, but really everything in life that involves the, gaining of energy involves some sort of electron transfer. So some sort of oxidation reduction reaction is always being used when we refer to metabolisms or any type of energy gaining reaction in life. So these are some examples of the kind of major categories of metabolisms that microbes carry out, but now let's get into the specific biogeochemical cycles, each one and how microbes drive these cycles, as well as some specific examples of metabolisms that affect and drive these cycles. So first things first, the carbon cycle. This is potentially the most fundamental biogeochemical cycle if we exclude like the water cycle. And microbes carry out both aerobic and anaerobic respiration, which oxidize organic carbon to CO2, releasing CO2 to the ocean and atmosphere, which provides a carbon source for other organisms, like photosynthesizing organisms, for example. Phototrophs, photosynthesizing organisms, then use that CO2 to produce organic carbon for the respirers once again. So it's this cycle between respiration and photosynthesis. Methanogens also play a major role in the carbon cycle because these are microbes that use CO2 to produce methane. And methanotrophs use methane to produce CO2. So this is its own little cycle. So all of these carbon cycles are occurring within the microbial realm, which are providing carbon sources for higher organisms that then produce organic carbon for organisms like ourselves. Both methane and carbon dioxide are the major inorganic carbon sources in the carbon cycle and play important roles as greenhouse gases. Now, I know in modern discussion, greenhouse gases get a bad rep, but greenhouse gases are essential for life on Earth. So we have to keep in mind that right now, the only reason they're getting a bad rep is because whenever there's a sharp increase or decrease in the concentration of greenhouse gases, that can cause a sharp increase or decrease in temperature, and any sharp fluctuations in temperature or any climatic parameter can cause harmful consequences because no life that has adapted over millions of years to live in a certain environment can adjust well to rapid change. However, that said, greenhouse gases over the course of Earth's history have been essential for maintaining life on Earth because we don't want all of Earth's heat to escape. So we do want that blanket of greenhouse gases to trap heat. We just don't want it to fluctuate too rapidly. Next, we have the nitrogen cycle. And like I mentioned earlier, this is potentially the cycle in which microbes play the most critical role of all the cycles because they are the only things that can convert atmospheric nitrogen into nitrogen compounds that are usable by other life. It's pretty crazy that this one reaction, this one type of bacteria controls all the other life on Earth because nitrogen is essential for all life on Earth. So the cycle is the nitrogen-fixing bacteria fix the nitrogen into ammonium or ammonia, which is then converted by nitrifying bacteria to nitrite or nitrate. And then denitrifying bacteria can convert the nitrogen back to atmospheric nitrogen gas. So they complete the cycle all on their own. in doing so providing all these variety of compounds for life to take up, like higher life, like plants, which we then eat and get our nitrogen from. The reason life needs nitrogen is to synthesize proteins, which, as I mentioned earlier, are essential for pretty much all life functions, and nucleic acids, like our DNA and RNA. So this is a really essential element for life. And again, without microbes to fix nitrogen, plants and animals, as we know them today, could never have evolved, or they probably would have taken a very different path because something would have had to evolve that capability. Now moving to the sulfur cycle. Sulfur is another CHNOPS element, in other words, another essential element for all life on Earth. And sulfate-reducing bacteria, or SRB, convert sulfate into hydrogen sulfide. Like I mentioned earlier when talking about different metabolisms that microbes have, they are able to use non-oxygen electron acceptors. We, in our electron transfer reaction, that is our metabolism, we use oxygen as the electron acceptor 100% of the time, and we cannot, do anything else. But some microbes, like these SRB, can use sulfate instead of oxygen to accept the electrons within their metabolic reaction. And in this case, they produce sulfide, which is then converted by sulfur oxidizing bacteria to elemental sulfur and sulfate, depending on the type of bacteria, which, like I mentioned earlier, are really cool because some of these sulfur oxidizing bacteria perform anoxygenic photosynthesis. In other words, photosynthesis that does not produce oxygen. Instead, they split H2S to produce sulfur instead of H2O to produce oxygen, which is just super cool. Other sulfur microbes metabolize or transform intermediate sulfur compounds between sulfate and sulfide in the spectrum of, how many electrons they have. In other words, there's a variety of other sulfur microbes out there that I don't have time to discuss, but the gist is microbes are the ones that are controlling the sulfur cycle and creating all of these types of sulfur compounds out there that life, like ourselves, can then use. We don't actually take up sulfur, but plants take up sulfate, and I think I also read that some can take up elemental sulfur, or that's still under debate, I don't know. But they take up these two types of sulfur, and thus we need the bacteria that produce these types of sulfur in order to drive, plant sulfur uptake, which we then, go and eat these plants, or we eat things that eat the plants, and we get our sulfur. Because sulfur is essential for plants and animals, microbial sulfur cycling is key for maintaining ecosystem health, as is a consistent theme throughout this video for all cycles. Next, we have the phosphorus cycle. As you may know, because phosphorus and nitrogen are big nutrients that we include in things like fertilizers, phosphorus is a major limiting nutrient for life, especially plant life, and therefore all other life on Earth, because it is, it just really likes to be in the geosphere, in other words, solid, which is really hard to get at. If you're a plant root, you are taking up water, which has your nutrients in it, and if phosphorus isn't dissolved in that water, then you're not going to be taking up phosphorus, which you need to live. So if it's just solid, it's really hard to get at. Therefore, we need microbes, which help to dissolve that phosphorus in order to make it available. All life needs phosphorus to form DNA, RNA, and ATP. Actually, ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate, and that phosphate group has phosphorus in it. Therefore, all the energy that life uses on Earth, ATP, requires phosphorus. So phosphorus is really important for life, and microbes drive the phosphorus cycle by breaking down organic compounds to release phosphate ions. These phosphate ions can then be used by plants and other organisms for growth and energy production. But it's not only organic compounds that microbes break down that release the phosphate ions. certain types of fungi and groups of bacteria prevent phosphorus deficiency in plants in a few ways. One, they promote root growth, which the roots are the things that are taking up the water and the whatever nutrients are there in the soil. And so if you promote the root growth, you're going to get a wider area to cover and potentially more phosphorus that you can find with your roots. And in addition to this, CO2 produced by respiring soil microbes, microbes that are respiring organic matter, converting reduced organic matter and oxidizing it into CO2, induce the formation of carbonic acid as that CO2 reacts with the water in the soil, and that further dissolves minerals that may contain phosphorus, which increases the availability of phosphorus to the plants. These bacteria also improve the plant's ability to acquire soil phosphorus by increasing the net bioavailable phosphate in the soil solution. And they often do this by adding what are called chelating agents or chelating molecules, which are organic anions or siderophores. Siderophores is a fancy name for an iron-specific molecule. It basically binds iron. Molecules like this are produced by bacteria in soil because iron is really important, again, for that nitrogenase enzyme that nitrogen-fixing bacteria use, but also many other enzymes. So siderophores are often employed by microbes to chelate or grab iron and take it back up into their cell and use the iron to produce proteins, etc. But they also produce organic anions, which is another fancy word for just a negatively charged ion or molecule that they can release, which react with cations, positively charged ions in the soil, like aluminum, calcium, and iron, removing them and preventing solid aluminum, iron, and calcium phosphate minerals from precipitating, thus increasing the availability of dissolved phosphate in the soil solution and therefore the availability of phosphate for plants to take up through their roots. Next, we have the iron and manganese cycles. Now, these are kind of like marginal cycles. They're not typically discussed when talking about the major biogeochemical cycles like the CHNOPS elements are, but they're really important still and bioessential, essential for life on Earth, and they're really strongly controlled by microbes. Because iron and manganese are redox-sensitive trace metals, in other words, they readily facilitate electron transfer reactions because they can give away and accept electrons relatively easily. They are key components for enzymes. Many microbes use iron and manganese for metabolism by oxidizing reduced iron and manganese to their oxidized and precipitated solid oxide mineral forms. In other words, they take reduced or ferrous iron from the solution. This is just iron 2+. It has more electrons than iron 3+. And then they take away one of those electrons through some reaction with something that wants those electrons. And they create iron 3+, which tends to form solid iron oxides. And the same thing basically goes for manganese. Manganese in its reduced form is typically 2+ ions, and they take this up and they oxidize it to manganese 4+. In other words, they take 2 electrons away from it, and this manganese 4+ reacts with oxygen to form solid manganese oxides, and this reaction gives the microbe energy because it transferred electrons. The equal and opposite type of metabolic pathway obviously also exists. There are also microbes that reduce oxidized iron and manganese back to their reduced forms, and this is kind of the simplified cycle. Because these microbes are controlling the dissolution and precipitation of the iron and manganese, they're thus controlling the availability of the iron and manganese ions for other organisms. Not only are they controlling the bioavailability or the availability of manganese and iron for higher life forms, but the formation of iron and manganese oxides is also really important for the availability of other trace metals, which point number one, trace metals of all sorts, like I mentioned earlier, molybdenum is an example. Who would have thought life needs molybdenum? But in some amounts, many trace metals, depending on the organism, are really essential for a lot of life's functions. And point number two, manganese and iron oxides are kind of like the universal scavengers of such trace metal ions in aqueous environments. In other words, where manganese and iron oxides are forming in marine systems, they are scavenging or adsorbing to their surfaces many metals, like here, hafnium, lead, thorium, molybdenum, uranium, thallium, copper, cobalt, barium, zinc, nickel, etc. And this controls the availability of all of these metals and potential nutrients for life, and thus controls their biogeochemical cycling and really affects life on Earth. Next, I want to talk a little bit about OM degradation, in other words, organic matter degradation by microbes. Who would have guessed? Basically, microbes break down complex organic matter into simpler compounds, and this decomposition process releases nutrients like carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus back into the ecosystem for other organisms to continue to use. In addition, organic matter decomposition also converts some organic carbon to CO2, which reacts with water in the soil or the ocean or wherever it is to form carbonic acid, which promotes mineral dissolution and the release of even more potential nutrients for life. Lastly, secondary metabolites. Microbes also produce secondary metabolites, in other words, compounds that are not directly involved in their primary metabolic pathways, but are kind of secondary products of their metabolisms, which can be really important for us, actually. Examples include antibiotics, pigments, enzymes, and other bioactive substances, which have applications in medicine, agriculture, energy, production, storage, recycling, etc. So, this is to emphasize that not only are microbes essential for animal and plant life, but also these, applications that we use them for. And this is to say basically all living things, and just, they're really important. So I don't know how geological this video was, but I just feel so strongly about how important microbes are for all Earth systems. And I myself, because I study how microbes affect sedimentation and rock formation and what we might gain from that in terms of learning how they affect signatures of past climatic and environmental conditions on Earth, all of that, because I study that, I really just have grown to appreciate the impact microbes have and have had on Earth for billions of years, and I hope to share why they're so impactful here. Because when I first learned this, I was just flabbergasted, and I just have a new sense of appreciation. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you want to check out the carbon sequestration video where I kind of touch on this, I'll link it up here, or the anaerobe to aerobe one, which is one of my favorite videos to date, but it doesn't get a lot of traction because it's kind of too biochemistry involving, but I think it's great. I think you'd like it. I'll link it up here too. And as always, my references are linked down below. And thank you so much for watching. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.